Whenever you speak inside an empty room, your voice bounces back. That echo is simple physics. Sound travels out, hits a surface, and returns. But there's a psychological version of this same principle that many people never realize exists. When a child reaches out emotionally, they're also waiting for something to come back. It doesn't have to be a long speech. Sometimes it's just a look, a softened expression, a hand on the shoulder, something that quietly says, "I see you. I hear you. You're real." But when nothing comes back, when the emotional sound disappears into silence, the child doesn't assume the room is broken. Children don't think that way. Instead, they assume the sound itself wasn't worth hearing. And that's where something subtle but powerful begins. For decades, psychology has mostly defined trauma as something visible and identifiable. A cas accident, abuse, a sudden loss, events with a clear before and after. And that framework absolutely matters. Those experiences are real and life-altering. But it has also left out an entire category of pain. The kind that doesn't come from what happened, but from what didn't. The house was still standing. The family photos were still on the wall. Maybe both parents were physically present. From the outside, everything looked fine. No one writes a memoir about the birthday that passed without acknowledgement. Or the afternoon a child cried alone in their room for an hour and no one came. Or the subtle, repeated moment when they tried to share something important and their caregiver's eyes drifted elsewhere. These aren't dramatic stories. They're quiet omissions. And because they're quiet, they're easy to dismiss, even by the person who lived through them. You can't point to a single explosive event. You can't easily explain it without feeling like you're exaggerating. But that doesn't mean it didn't leave a mark. Psychologists call this childhood emotional neglect, and it remained understudied for a long time precisely because of how it works. It isn't defined by a specific harmful action. It's defined by absence. The emotional attunement that never came. The reflection that never happened. The steady sense of being emotionally unseen. Here's the developmental reality underneath that. Children learn about their inner world the same way they learn language, through reflection. A caregiver who says, "You seem sad right now. Is that right?" is doing something incredibly important. They're teaching the child that emotions exist, that they can be named, that they matter enough to be noticed. Without that reflection, something crucial is missing. If this kind of mirroring rarely happens, the child may grow into an adult who genuinely struggles to identify what they're feeling. Not because they're cold or detached, but because no one ever helped them build that vocabulary. There's even a clinical term for this, alexithymia. It refers to difficulty recognizing and describing one's own emotional states. Research consistently shows higher rates of it in people who experienced emotional neglect early in life. This isn't a personality flaw. It's a gap shaped by absence. Imagine spending your whole life in a room where nothing echoes back, and then being told to just speak up. What often develops in adulthood is a profile that therapists recognize immediately, but the person living it finds deeply confusing. These individuals are frequently high-functioning, responsible, reliable, the kind of person everyone describes as doing great. And they often are, on paper. They learned early how to present as fine, because being fine was safer than having needs. Clinician John Ice Webb, who brought significant attention to childhood emotional neglect, describes clients who don't arrive with a clear crisis. Instead, they describe a vague but persistent sense that something is off. Not classic depression, not textbook anxiety, more like emotional flatness, like living slightly removed from life, as though there's glass between them and everyone else. In relationships, that's where the pattern becomes most painful. Someone offers a genuine compliment, and they deflect it, laugh it off, change the subject. Someone loves them steadily and consistently, and instead of feeling safe, it feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. There's a quiet expectation that it will disappear, which makes perfect sense. If love was inconsistent growing up, you eventually stopped relying on it. You adapted. You became self-sufficient, independent, the one who doesn't need much, the one who has it handled. From the outside, that looks like strength. But often, it's an old survival strategy. Needs don't vanish. They just get quieter. Over time, they stop making noise because noise never worked. A 2024 scoping review published in the journal Child Abuse and Neglect analyzed 25 separate studies and found consistent evidence that adults who experience neglect in childhood often struggle significantly with emotional regulation later in life. Even more telling, the researchers noted that emotional neglect remains one of the least studied forms of childhood adversity. The most invisible wound is often the least understood. And here's something essential to understand. The way you adapted wasn't a mistake. It was a solution, a remarkably intelligent response to an environment where shrinking yourself felt safer than expressing yourself. The quiet child learned that silence prevented disappointment. The funny child learned that humor guaranteed attention. The overachiever discovered that success brought validation. The caretaker learned that being useful secured connection. These weren't random personality traits. They were strategies, and they worked. The problem is coping mechanisms don't automatically retire when the environment changes. You may not be in that emotionally silent room anymore, but your nervous system might still act like you are. You might flinch when someone gets too close, feel uneasy when someone is genuinely kind, struggle to identify what you're feeling, as if trying to hear through a wall. But here's the hopeful part. This isn't permanent. The brain is capable of change, even after difficult beginnings. Therapeutic approaches specifically designed for attachment wounds and emotional neglect can make a meaningful difference. But healing this kind of pain is rarely dramatic. It's slow, and it often involves grieving something intangible, the absence of what should have been. How do you mourn something that never happened? How do you process a lack of memory? Usually with time, with support, with patience. And it starts somewhere smaller than therapy. It starts with deciding that your own experience counts. Just because no one consistently showed up for your emotions doesn't mean they weren't worth showing up for. They were. They always were. In daily life, this doesn't look like a huge breakthrough. It looks like noticing you're angry, and instead of instantly dismissing it, allowing it to exist for a moment. It looks like catching yourself brushing off a compliment and pausing to ask why. It looks like quietly checking in with your own inner state, even if you're not sure what you'll find. For someone who grew up emotionally unseen, learning to see yourself is radical, and it won't transform overnight. But every honest check-in shifts something slightly. If you've been listening to this and felt a quiet recognition, like a wordless "this sounds familiar," pay attention to that. Sometimes simply having language for an experience doesn't fix it, but it does something important. It creates an echo. Maybe faint, maybe unfamiliar, but real. The sound was never the problem. It just needed a different room. And if any part of this resonated with you, if it helped put language to something you've carried privately, you're not alone. There's more to explore, more to understand, and more to heal. I'll see you in the next one.